Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Agroni. I'm a published fantasy author with over 10 years of experience as a professional writer and editor. Happy to be back. I haven't been able to do an episode in a little while. I've been a little bit busy, but I definitely have a really cool thing to get to today, actually, because we have an email from a listener. And while I don't know the topic at hand, as usual, our producer, Natalia Emmons, assures me that it's going to be a fun one. Very much looking forward to that. And I also wanted to mention that our healing magic episode went really well. It seemed like people had a lot of cool thoughts about that. So we are talking about maybe doing a part 2 for that. So stay tuned for that. That would be really fun because we do have so many things to go through with healing magic that we didn't get to. And so I guess that's a good thing. But there you go. All right. So email from a listener. I'm opening up right now. Here we go. Okay, so this comes to us from Blake. Blake's subject line here is, how do I make a character immortal? Okay, here we go. Hello and good morning slash afternoon slash evening. I guess for now it's morning. Yeah, that's when we're doing this. I have a question since this has been bothering me today. How do I make a character immortal? And what ways can I make them? So I have this one character called Equia. So they spell it Equia. I think I'm saying that right. Equia. And she's immortal. Now, I don't know why I made her immortal. At the time, I just thought it was cool. Valid. When I made her, I need ideas on how she became immortal. I have 3 ways on how she might have. So one is where she had her aging time stopped by the time god. This sounds cringe, so I abandoned this. It sounds a little bit anime mixed with Age of Adeline. One where her soul was stripped from her as a child, granting the immortality but also eternal hunger. Oh wow. And one which I thought of today. It's that she died before, but was revived by her demigod friend and was given something to be immortal. Like how in Greek mythology, the gods give ambrosia and nectar, then dangle them on embers to make people immortal. I'm not the biggest Greek mythology expert, but I buy that, especially because I did watch Hercules. So, which or what do I do? I really like the soul stripping one since the side effects of it are pivotal for her character. That's probably the most original. But it gets confusing. How? Well, I have a group of other characters who are immortal and are called witches. These are different from other witches because they don't usually do those potion herbs kind of magic voodoo. They get their cool and unique powers and immortality from powerful figures taking their soul in the form of a deal. This has to be consensual, and there needs to be a reason for this transaction. Whether it's for power or to protect, there needs to be a reason why the figure takes the soul. Why do they need the soul specifically? I'm still figuring that out. Back to the topic of why the second option of making Equia immortal is confusing. There is no reason for that figure to take her soul. She's just a kid at that time, and she has no reason to make a deal with anyone for anything because her brain isn't that mature yet to be thinking of these things. It doesn't make sense and it's confusing, and the figure can't just take her soul because it needs consent to get it. So I ask again, what do I do? Or pick? Do I need to make something new that fits more perfectly or pick from the options I gave? Right off the bat, the first thing is you're making a very crucial mistake, which is you are trying to make these decisions about how a character gets their powers and how a character, like what would make it less confusing, how these things would function before it sounds to me like you have a story. What is the story? That impacts all of this. Who is Equia? What kind of person is Equia? What does immortality do for her as a character? And that is going to go hand in hand with all these questions you're asking. It sounds to me like you maybe have a plot. Maybe you have an idea like Equia is going to go on this adventure. Equia is going to do this. She's going to fight these witches and so on. But what's the story? What's the why behind all of this? Because that's going to inform the theme, of course, of the immortality that you're going for. That's not to say that you have to have all these figured out from page 1. Maybe you're not sure what the theme is exactly yet, but maybe you have a vague notion of, I want to tell a story about immortality, not just because it's cool, but also because, yes, it's been done before, but is there anything people haven't done yet with immortality? Or is there a way for me to take an example of a story with an immortal character and do something with it in a different context? Take a type of immortal character we've seen in something like, let's say, Vampire Diaries, and instead of it being like a vampire thing, you decide to put it in a totally different context, like a sci-fi, for example. You change the genre, but then you keep kind of the same sort of, I guess, like aesthetic of the immortality stuff. It kind of reminds me of something that in his most recent lectures, Brandon Sanderson was talking about how you can do this all the time with characters and plot. You can, for example, just mix 2 things together to get yourself started. right? And it might not seem original at first, but it becomes original as you work on it. So I think the example he gave you was like, what if the Godfather, but all the characters are mice, right? And so that on its own is something that immediately gets like, oh, okay, yeah, I can wrap my head around this. And then you can figure out all those little details of, maybe things that feel confusing, the soul stripping, how all that stuff works. It sounds to me like you're trying to figure out all of the little parts, but what's the car? Right? What does the car of this thing actually look like? You're focusing on the engine, which is great. You want the engine to run, right? You want there to be cup holders, but what is this thing overall? What kind of car is it? How fast is it going to go? And what is something about this car that's going to make people want to buy it? I don't know why I'm doing a car metaphor. This is a fantasy podcast, but what are we going to do, right? I have plenty of other thoughts today, though. I want to dig in a little bit more in detail because I think that to me, it's less of you asking like how to make a character immortal or how to write immortal characters, I guess. I think the more important thing is like, how do you make immortality interesting, right? And I guess like for me, it's super relatable to just look at a character like Equia and be like, I want them to be immortal because that's cool, Honestly, I think that that's a great place to start. Maybe some people will turn their nose at that, but I'm just like, yeah, it's cool. Immortal characters can be cool as long as you do it right, you know. And I think the thing you have to focus on is making sure that that choice to make a character immortal always feels intentional for the reader. It's always going to feel intentional for you because you intended to do it, but you always have to think in the reader's head, why is this story have an immortal character? Can you easily answer that question? Yeah, who knows? Hopefully. So let's go through some ideas then, or let's go through the ideas they mentioned. So the time god thing, and then the one with the soul stripping and the demigod friend. I think that those were the three, and let's unpack each one. Because I think that it sounds to me like they're already leaning toward the soul stripping thing. It's kind of the most original. And maybe I'm saying that I just, even though Oblivion Remastered came out. And so people are casting Soul Trap all over again. But I promise that's not why maybe I have that same bias. I think in terms of like stepping back and unpacking these things, the bigger question to me here is why is Blake, this writer who's writing in, why are they stuck? Right? Because to me, this isn't really about world building. It's about hesitation, which is a totally normal thing. We call it in some circles creative paralysis. So, this is when we dive into how writers can be indecisive when developing the origin points of their story. And it can be really easy to, unfortunately, get overwhelmed when the answer to these questions isn't immediately clear. Sometimes we call it writer's block too, but that's a whole can of worms. I don't want to use that term and confuse people. So you're going to hear from lots of different writers, myself included, on why indecision like this tends to happen. It usually means that you are on the edge of discovering your characters, and pay attention to this. Don't tune me out. Your character's real emotional truth. And this is a super important thing. We haven't talked about it too much in this podcast. Let's get super nerdy about it though. What does immortality actually do to a character? Okay. How do you make it a source of tension, right? Instead of just a cheat code. We've all seen, not we've all, but many of you have probably seen those anime that are just like power fantasies, right? They don't have a lot of tension. Literally, some of them are just like, I'm the main character and I got a cheat code. Now I can do all the things I couldn't do when I sucked. Like it's a whole genre. But that's not really the thing that we're going for because a lot of that stuff just tends to be, you know, manufactured slop, intended to be slop. There you go. But let's pull some other examples, right? And some things of let's maybe even take a look at some Marvel characters, right? Because I think for wish fulfillment to work, wish fulfillment in a character, whether it's immortality or whether it's a character with all kinds of amazing powers, you need a dark side to this to work. And a lot of writers get this stuff wrong when their immortal characters start to feel invincible instead of vulnerable. The obvious, most famous example would be Superman, not exactly immortal, but all powerful, right? Same kind of concept. But I don't want to pull too far away from what Blake is asking. So Blake's talking about witches and immortal characters in general, the differences and all that. And this concept of immortality coming from these consensual soul deals. And I would say, like what my question to that would be, what if immortality itself is undeserved? Okay, what if Equia's story is actually about reconciling a gift that she didn't ask for, right? One that violates the very rules that keep her world balanced, her personal world, and the world of her real emotional truth. Okay, so let's explore that a little bit. This is where chosen one tropes tend to come in, right? And we can subvert that as writers, very much so, because we want to, and because chosen one tropes are made to be subverted these days. And then you also want to build a magic system that has some moral boundaries, and you want to write immortal characters who feel like people instead of plot devices. Okay, that's always super, super important. So let's start with the basic. Why does immortality usually trip us up? Why does this tend to happen? I think the moment you give a character immortality, you've taken away one of the most fundamental sources of tension in a story, which is death. Okay. And if you don't replace that tension with something else, something that can be deeply emotional or narratively complex, then you end up with a character who starts to feel kind of empty. And again, like kind of like that cheat code I was talking about. Maybe they look cool, but they start to feel less and less real, to the reader. It doesn't matter if everything about them is unreal, depending on the genre and how they dress and all that stuff. The emotional truth we're talking about is the thing that needs to feel real. And emotional truth goes hand in hand with things like consequences, death being the ultimate one. And so if you decide to do an immortal character, you are taking away one of the easy sort of like, can the character survive this? Well, the answer to that question in this kind of story would be, yeah, because they're immortal, unless you invent something that makes them not immortal or like a weakness to immortality. But then you kind of defeat the purpose there. So that's a whole other thing. So then to me, the real question Blake needs to be asking, or any of you who want to write an immortal character, is what is the cost of your character's immortality? Okay. And I don't mean that in like a magic system kind of way necessarily, right? Like, oh, she has to recharge her immortality every 100 years or something kind of, nerdy like that, which I mean, I love nerdy stuff, but I think in terms of cost, what is the emotional cost? That's way more important, at least to me. And I think a lot of readers who want to be hooked into your story. So, what is the cost in terms of her soul, her arc in the story, and her sense of self? Sense of self is such an important aspect of that. Because if you have a question, or if you have a character questioning their sense of self, their identity, who they think they are, immortality has all kinds of different layers to that. So many interesting, thought provoking, like, who am I if I don't die? Who am I if I'm in a world where I'm just existing and existing and existing? Great example would be the Immortal from Invincible, as the Robert Kirkman comic and the great show on Amazon Prime Video. I very much enjoy it. But that's a character who, not a main character, but the story does play with him a little bit in terms of like he survived for all this time. Another example would be DC's, what's his name, Savage or whatever it is, the one who Victor Savage, I forget, but he's been alive for since like the cavemen days, and he's just existed in this world for a long time. And the cost to that immortality is his soul. He is just turned into a sociopathic husk of his former self. So this kind of stuff has happened all the time. So that already could start getting you wondering, like, all right, this is about a character who is immortal, but it isn't at that point where they've been alive for hundreds or thousands of years, but they know they will be. And that's where you can start to play with some stuff of like, oh, I know this character, or this character knows that they're destined to not die. But they're still a teenager. They've only been around for 15 years. And so how does that affect them? Right? Their sense of self and how they see themselves. Because you don't see a lot of stories like that, right? Usually writers are like, immortal character, that means they've been around forever. And that's the easy route to go because that's what's expected. But you can do all kinds of fun things. So let's go through again. I promised we'd go through the different options. The time god thing. So the time god freezes the aging. And I would say, because you called this one cringe, you abandoned it. And I'm going to argue that I think it's only cringe if you don't take it seriously. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense. But like, I personally think that if you tweak this, it could work. It definitely could work because time gods are actually kind of fantastic in terms of their potential when you use them correctly. So the Wheel of Time kind of has stuff close to this. Discworld has some good examples. Doctor Who, if I don't know, I'm not the biggest Doctor Who person, but I want to say Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood might have this too. But again, I'm not the big Full Metal Alchemist fan, so I have to defer to our producer Bridget Surdock. But I do think that these things all kind of play with divine figures who can kind of warp time. Black Clover does this a little bit with the Wizard King. He has like these amazing time powers, not necessarily a god, but pretty close. I think a key to characters like this, though, is that a time god needs to represent something more than a cool idea. So why would this god freeze Equia's aging? You're already on the right track of being like, well, the why. What's the purpose of something like this? And I think if you treat the time god less like a character and more like some kind of force of nature, something closer to fate or inevitability or maybe even punishment, for something that Equia is not guilty for, but their parent is guilty for example. That's where you can start to build something kind of interesting there. But look, you already said maybe this concept isn't going to work. Maybe for you, it's not emotionally resonating. If that's still the case, just move on. You can toss it. So we'll go to your second option, which is the soul being stripped from them as a child. And so I think you said that that gives them immortality, but also some kind of eternal hunger. So there's some interesting stuff here too. I would say like, yeah, that's kind of where I would lean because you already are baking in that cost I was talking about. Like there's some tension baked in. You have some kind of premise there, immortality, but also eternal hunger. So this is pretty similar to Pirates of the Caribbean, where the whole driving force of the antagonists in that is that these pirates, they're immortal, but they look like skeletons at night. They're always hungry. They can't taste or feel. So this has been done, but from the villain perspective, I think we've seen this, probably a bunch of times from the hero's perspective, but I couldn't cite an example off the top of my head. But I do think either way, you're running into a little bit of a logistics problem because if this world requires soul deals to be consensual and Equia was a kid, then how does that work? And so you brought this up yourself. Like, if it's consensual, how could a kid consent to something like this? You're kind of dipping into territory that you probably don't want to dip into. So first of all, I wouldn't use the word consensual there just because the implication of a word like that. And maybe think of it more, or maybe you can tweak the lore a little bit to make it just have a little bit more pop, a little bit more intentionality behind it. So my initial idea would be, what if the soul was given away for her? Right. So someone else made the deal essentially on her behalf. This happens all the time with kids. Parents make decisions for their kids all the time, whether it's a desperate parent, maybe an older sibling who's looking out for their younger sibling, or even like a stranger, like a benefactor who saw something in this kid and broke the rules, in terms of like, oh, normally you have to make the soul deal, but Equia didn't, and then Equia has to live with what happened to her in that case. She didn't ask for immortality, and now she has to suffer from it. You could treat it less as like a gift and more of something that brings on guilt, right? And the mystery behind that too. You can make a whole mystery out of like Equia grows up not knowing why she's immortal, who gave her this gift. And that could even be baked into the story of trying to find out who did this to her. You're already on track with something like that to develop a really interesting flow of a story there. But, you could also say, like, what if she did make the deal, right? But she doesn't remember it. Maybe like because she has like a false memory, or as a child, she wasn't smart enough or mature enough to interpret the deal the correct way. And so then as the story progresses, she and the reader together uncover what actually happened there. So this lets you keep the witch lore stuff intact. They can still work hand in hand, but it makes Equia still different and stand out and more special because the circumstances of how she brought on her immortality are just all the more different. Now, if you do want the immortality for her to be a different kind of power subset altogether, you have to work really hard with that because it can, as you already alluded to, be super confusing for people because it's like, well, what's the difference between Equia and a witch? Is Equia a witch? If you don't want that to be the case, you have to build to that and you have to make that part of the story as like, that is a hook of like, in a world where the only immortal people are witches, a young child finds herself, although not a witch, the only normal human who is also immortal. So something along those lines. And then you create the mystery out of that and you slowly build that for the reader to be like, and that means the witches are after her because she shouldn't exist. She's an anomaly, right? Think of Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, for example. So, okay. So then the third option you gave was, what if she died and was revived by some kind of like demigod friend, I think they said. And then the immortality was like a divine gift. So, I like this. I think it's got like a solid mythic structure. I think that's easy for people to kind of get of like, yeah, this one character with lots of power gives this other character with no power some power. It's a very clean kind of approach. The danger is that sometimes clean approaches like this can be a little boring if you don't work at it. So you have to dirty it up a little bit. I should say this more often, but yeah, when you have some kind of like premise that just doesn't seem to be working, dirty it up. Okay. What I mean is, ask yourself, what if immortality is given as a curse disguised as a gift? You think it's a good thing, but actually it's really bad. The demigod wanted to save her, but didn't understand what giving her that power would do. So similar to, I guess, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Castlevania does this with Lisa and Dracula. So you kind of get that like tragic god human clash. And so, what I mean is, instead of the demigod going in with good intentions and a good thing happening, they go in with good intentions, but a bad thing happens. That feels more tragic, feels more sad. It gets you thinking of like, it creates a good sort of, back and forth where this demigod character keeps coming on from wants to coming up in the story and actually wants to, you know, work things out with Equia. But of course, Equia is like, "Ah, you cursed me with immortality. I didn't want this," and that kind of thing. So yeah, those are your three approaches. Lots of things, different things you can do there. I do want to zoom out before we finish though and say that I honestly think that a lot of this stuff, like the solutions here, aren't really about Equia or writing some kind of immortal character. I think what you're going through here, what you're really doing is something that all writers go through. You're stuck between what feels cool and what feels true, emotionally true, like I was talking about before. I can already tell from the email and the stuff you're setting up, you have strong instincts, especially for world building. You have these witches, you have these rules and solo deals, you're thinking through this stuff, but it seems to me like your gut is telling you that there's some kind of hole in the logic. And, that's a good thing that you're reaching out when that happens, because that's what you should do when a writer hits the wall. You know that something is missing, but you're too close to the problem to see what the problem really is and what's causing it. And so sometimes the issue in these cases isn't necessarily the lore, like I was saying. It's that we haven't asked what the power means to the character, right? So the best way to write an immortal character is to define what death still means to them. That's step one. So, what does death really mean to Equia as somebody who maybe, for example, maybe didn't know that they were going to be immortal? They found out when they were age 10. What does death mean to them then? How does that change? Right? Or what if Equia has known all along that she's immortal, grew up this way? That means death would mean something very different to her. And that's the best way to write a character like that, is to define through those details. And so the way that writers tend to mess this up, though, is that immortal characters can feel bland when they don't feel anything, right? So they shrug off consequences, they don't grow. This happens with a lot of versions of Superman, unfortunately, because if a character can't die, what do they fear, right? What do they desire? What do they regret? So the Old Guard on Netflix movie about kind of like these characters, like they're warriors who can't die, Charlize Theron. That's probably a good example too, because the real story in the Old Guard is not about invincibility. It's about how many times they've watched everyone else die. Right? Lord of the Rings, very similar. The romance between Aragon and I forget her name, the elf lady he loves, played by Liv Tyler. But I always think Galadriel, like the one played by what's her name? I'm blanking on names. One thing after another. Famous actress from Where'd You Go, Bernadette? Why did I pick Where'd You Go, Bernadette? Benjamin Button. Anyway, we just need to stop embarrassing myself. But that's another thing where it's a character, it's a tragic romance because you're going to eventually watch this person die. The Immortal from Invincible through this as well. So that's an example of an angle you can take. It's been done. So there are other ways you can subvert the tropes that maybe is more true to your story, though, right? So you could do something truly unexpected with Equia, for example. You can make her wish that she could die, but she can't figure out how. Logan, with Wolverine, right, is a good example of that. Interview with the Vampire is a good example of that. You can let her believe that she's immortal, but then slowly realize that the immortality is breaking down. I think that's kind of how Old Guard went about it. And that actually was kind of crazy, because then it's like death means this certain thing to somebody, and then they lose it. And then you don't know what you had until you lose, like that kind of thing. How do they feel in that situation? You can build a whole story around that. You can also build the story around Equia as some kind of living myth. Someone the world believes can't die, and she's trying to keep up the illusion. Maybe she isn't as immortal as everybody thinks. These are all just spitballing examples, but the real final thing here is that you have the right instincts. You're asking questions that matter. You're building rules. You're trying to make things logical. But most importantly, you should be listening to the parts of the story that don't feel right. Okay. And that's the hardest thing to learn as a writer for all of us. Figuring out what doesn't feel right and knowing how to kill your darlings and how to scrap things, even if you like them because they're your babies. And so what I would do, and you don't have to listen to me, but I would maybe pick the soul stripping idea, give it some structure, dirty it up, and let Equia spend some time, spend the whole story really trying to understand what was taken from her and why and what it means to her. And then somewhere near the climax, let her try to remember or maybe even learn the truth, of who she really is. And so that would be the kind of immortality a character like her and the reader would remember and would really stand out. So hopefully this was helpful, and I know that it was a lot, but I think at the risk of being, making it seem like I live forever and I won't end this conversation, I will end it there. So that was a little joke about finality in an episode about immortality. Anyway, thank you so much for listening or watching Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. Very glad you did. Don't forget, if you like the show at all, or if you want your own advice to be answered, you can hit us up anytime, fantasywritingforbarbarians@gmail.com. We also have a Discord. We have folks, not just me, kind of engaging with other writers who are asking awesome questions and trying to, plug the holes of their story, as it were. We'll try to do another episode sooner and not do as many gaps, hopefully. And hopefully we'll do that healing magic once again soon. Also, if you do like the show and you want to support it in some way, the easiest thing you can do is leave a nice little review or rating on a podcast app that lets you do that. Usually it's Spotify or Apple Podcasts, whatever you like. But yeah, that'll do it for now. Be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.